Clover Ainsworth's entire existence could be summarized by the frantic prayer currently looping in her mind. Please don't let me trip. Please don't let me fall. Please don't let me set anything on fire. It was a familiar mantra, one that had accompanied her through school assemblies, job interviews, and even simple trips to the market. Today, however, it carried the weight of a kingdom. She stood in the antechamber of the great throne room, her hands so slick with nervous sweat that she was certain she'd drop the leather-bound portfolio she clutched to her chest. It contained her credentials, her letters of recommendation, and a detailed plan for reorganizing the Royal Library's archaic cataloging system, a project she'd poured her heart into, a dream assignment that now felt more like a looming execution. The silk of her borrowed dress, a demure forest green, felt alien against her skin. It was far grander than anything she owned, and the hem seemed to be actively plotting her downfall, whispering threats of tangling around her ankles with every shallow breath she took. The air in the castle was heavy, thick with the scent of old stone, beeswax, and an undercurrent of something wild and powerful that made the tiny, dormant wolf within her tremble. It was the scent of the Alpha King. Even here, separated by yards of stone and a set of massive oak doors, his presence was a physical weight. Alpha King Stellan Graves. They called him the Stone King, a monarch whose heart had supposedly turned to granite 12 years ago after the tragic loss of his parents in a rogue attack. He ruled with unyielding logic and cold efficiency. Stories of his reign were told in hushed, respectful tones. He had fortified the borders, unified the sparring northern and southern pacts, and brought a stark, unwavering order to the kingdom. But there were other stories, too. Whispers of a king who never smiled, whose voice was devoid of warmth, whose eyes were chips of flint. A king who had not laughed since he was a boy. The court reflected its ruler. From what little Clover had seen, it was a place of rigid formality, of perfect posture and muted whispers. There was no room for error, no space for a misplaced step or a clumsy gesture. There was no room for someone like her. Just get through the introduction, she whispered to herself, her voice a faint tremor. Bow, present your portfolio, don't speak unless spoken to, and back away slowly. You can do this. She couldn't. She knew she couldn't. Disaster was woven into the fabric of her being as surely as her Omega status. She was born to be overlooked, to serve quietly in the background. This brief, terrifying moment in the spotlight felt like a violation of natural law. A stern-faced beta with a silver wolf's head clasp on his tunic appeared at her side, his scent sharp with impatience. The king will see you now, Librarian Ainsworth. Do not dawdle. And do not, under any circumstances, make direct eye contact unless he invites it. His gaze flickered over her, a quick, dismissive appraisal that made her feel 2 inches tall. It was the look she'd seen her whole life, the look that said Omega, unimportant, weak. She swallowed hard, nodding, the motion jerky. The massive doors swung open with a low groan, and a wave of silence washed over her. The throne room was immense, a cavern of polished marble and soaring arches. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the floor in jewels of colored light. But the light didn't seem to touch the figure on the throne. King Stellan sat utterly still, a man forged from shadow and steel. He was even more imposing in person than the official portraits suggested. Broad shoulders were encased in a severe black tunic. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his face was a mask of cold, handsome neutrality. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of his castle, his expression unreadable, bored, and utterly empty. The court, a silent sea of silks and velvets, flanked the long carpet leading to the dais. Every eye was on her. She could feel their collective judgment, their curiosity, their disdain. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. 1 foot in front of the other, she commanded herself. She started the long walk, her borrowed shoes pinching her toes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic tap of her heels on the marble. Tap, tap, tap. Each step was a small victory. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor just ahead, a patch of ruby-red light from a window depicting a legendary wolf battle. Just a few more yards. You're almost there. The portfolio felt impossibly heavy. She adjusted her grip, her sweaty fingers slipping on the smooth leather. And then it happened. The hem of her dress, the treacherous fiend, caught on the heel of her shoe. It was a small snag, a minor inconvenience that a graceful person would have corrected with a simple flick of the ankle. Clover Ainsworth was not a graceful person. She stumbled forward, her balance deserting her in a rush of panicked adrenaline. The portfolio flew from her grasp, skidding across the floor. She flailed, her arms windmilling wildly as she fought a losing battle with gravity. Her forward momentum carried her off the carpet and directly into a towering suit of antique armor that stood sentinel beside the dais. The clang of her body hitting the polished steel was shockingly loud in the silent room. A collective gasp, sharp and horrified, rippled through the court. The suit of armor, a relic from the time of the first kings, teetered for a horrifying moment before crashing backward, with a deafening cacophony of metal on stone. Clover's horror was a living thing, choking her, but the universe was not yet finished with her humiliation. The armor's ornate helmet, dislodged by the impact, flew through the air in a graceful, terrible arc. It struck the wall with a dull thud, snagging the corner of a massive, ancient tapestry that depicted the founding of the Graves Pack. The tapestry, woven with threads of silver and gold, was priceless, and it was hanging directly above a row of lit ceremonial torches. The helmet's impact was just enough to pull the bottom corner of the fabric into the waiting flame. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a tiny lick of orange appeared, tasting the ancient threads. It grew with alarming speed, a hungry snake of fire climbing the priceless artifact. A woman in the front row screamed. The scent of smoke, sharp and acrid, began to fill the air. Guards surged forward, shouting orders. The perfect, cold order of the Stone King's court had been shattered into a million pieces of chaos. And at the center of it all was Clover, sprawled on the floor amidst a heap of dented armor, her face frozen in a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She finally dared to lift her gaze to the throne. The king was looking at her now. Every shred of boredom was gone from his face. His flint-gray eyes were wide, fixed on her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. This was it. This was the legendary wrath. She would be banished, imprisoned, or worse. Her life was over. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable roar of fury that would seal her doom. The sound that came from the throne was not a roar. It was a strange, choked noise, like an engine seizing up. Clover cautiously opened her eyes. King Stellan's shoulders were shaking. His hands, which had been resting impassively on the arms of his throne, were now gripping them so tightly his knuckles were white. A dark flush was creeping up his neck, staining his pale skin. His lips were parted, and the strange, sputtering sound came again, louder this time. Then it happened. Alpha King Stellan Graves threw his head back and laughed. It was not a chuckle or a polite laugh of amusement. It was a full-bodied, soul-shaking bellow of pure, uncontrollable mirth. It was the sound of a landslide, of a dam breaking after centuries of pressure. It echoed off the high ceilings, filled every corner of the vast room, and washed over the stunned court like a tidal wave. He laughed until tears streamed from his eyes, carving glistening tracks down his stoic face. He pointed a trembling finger at the scene of destruction, at her, at the fallen armor, at the burning tapestry that guards were now frantically trying to extinguish. He laughed until he was breathless, clutching his stomach as if in pain. The entire court was frozen, staring at their king as if he'd grown a second head. They had never heard this sound. They didn't know it existed. Finally, gasping for air, the king raised a hand. His voice, when he spoke, was still thick with laughter, but it held the unmistakable ring of absolute authority. "Stop," he commanded the guards who were about to douse the tapestry. They froze, buckets in hand. "Nobody," the king wheezed, another wave of laughter shaking him. "Fix anything. Leave it all." He leaned forward, his gray eyes, now shining with a light no one had seen in 12 years, locking directly onto Clover's. You, he said, a wide, genuine, unbelievable smile spreading across his face. Librarian, come here. Stellan had not felt. For 12 years, he had simply existed. He sat on his throne, a construct of duty and grief, and presided over a kingdom that ran with the cold precision of a well-oiled machine. His days were a grayscale procession of meetings, decrees, and judgments. He ate without tasting, slept without dreaming, and ruled without feeling. The wolf within him, the great silver alpha that had once been his strength and his joy, was a dormant beast, sleeping in a cage of ice forged on the day his parents died. It had not stirred, not truly, in 4,380 days. He knew because he had counted each one. He had been listening to the beta drone on about grain shipments, his mind a million miles away, when the throne room doors had opened. He had not bothered to look. It was another functionary, another cog in the machine. A librarian, his schedule had informed him. An Omega. Unimportant. He'd felt the shift in the room's atmosphere, the collective intake of breath, but had dismissed it as the court's usual fawning anxiety. Then came the first sound that broke through the gray fog. A feminine gasp, a frantic scuffling, and then a clang so loud and undignified it was like a stone thrown into a perfectly still pond. His head had snapped up, and he saw her. A slip of a woman in a green dress, tangled up with Sir Reginald the Valiant's fourth best suit of armor. The sight was so absurd, so out of place in his sterile court, that it was like a splash of vibrant color on a monochrome canvas. His wolf, the sleeping beast, shifted in its icy cage. A low growl of interest, the first in over a decade, rumbled deep in his chest. Then came the helmet, the tapestry, the flame. It was a symphony of chaos, a masterpiece of pandemonium. The court panicked, guards rushed, a woman screamed, and Stellan felt something unfamiliar bubble up from the depths of his frozen soul. It was a strange, tickling pressure behind his sternum, a warmth that spread through his veins like wildfire. His wolf was awake. It was standing now, pressing against the bars of its cage, its golden eyes wide and fixed on the epicenter of the beautiful disaster. On the woman. The Omega librarian with wide, terrified doe eyes and soot smudged on her cheek. And his wolf spoke a single, definitive word that slammed into his consciousness with the force of a physical blow. Mate. The pressure in his chest exploded. The laugh that ripped from his throat was a foreign sound, a violent, cathartic release of 12 years of pent-up nothingness. It hurt. His ribs ached, his throat was raw, but he couldn't stop. The sheer, unadulterated chaos of it all was the most wonderful thing he had ever witnessed. She had not just tripped. She had orchestrated a domino effect of pure, unscripted mayhem. She had brought down a priceless relic and set fire to a piece of history, all with a single misstep. It was magnificent. The faces of his court were a study in horrified disbelief. They looked from him to the burning tapestry and back again, their perfect composure shattered. They thought he had finally lost his mind. Perhaps he had. When he finally managed to catch his breath, he gave the order. Nobody fix anything. He wanted to preserve this moment. He wanted to look at that singed tapestry, at that dented suit of armor, every single day, and remember the sound of the ice in his soul cracking. He wanted to remember her. His gaze found her again, still on the floor, looking at him with the expression of a frightened rabbit. The fear in her scent was a sharp, painful sting. His wolf whined, a sudden, desperate urge to soothe her, to go to her and wrap her in his arms, to tell her she had done nothing wrong, to tell her she had done everything right. You, he said, the smile still stretching his unused muscles. Librarian, come here. She flinched, scrambling to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much. She kept her head bowed, her hands clasped so tightly they were bloodless. She approached the dais slowly, her entire being radiating shame and terror. He could smell it, a heartbreaking mix of rain-soaked earth and old parchment, laced with the bitter tang of fear. It was the most intoxicating scent he had ever encountered. My wolf recognized you from the first moment. A voice that was his and not his whispered in his mind. She stopped a few feet from the throne, her eyes still fixed on the floor. Your Majesty, she whispered, her voice trembling. I am so profoundly sorry. I will accept any punishment. I can pay for the damages, even if it takes the rest of my life. Stellan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, forcing himself to soften his voice. The urge to command her to look at him, to use his alpha authority, was a physical ache, but he knew it would only terrify her more. Punishment? He asked, a genuine note of confusion in his tone. Librarian Ainsworth, for what, precisely, should you be punished? She risked a glance up at him, her hazel eyes wide and swimming with confusion. For all of this, she stammered, gesturing vaguely at the beautiful destruction she had wrought. The armor, the tapestry. The tapestry was a dreary old thing, Stellan said dismissively, waving a hand. Frankly, a bit of fire damage gives it character. And Sir Reginald was, by all accounts, an insufferable bore. I consider it an improvement. A nervous titter went through the court. They were beginning to recalibrate, to understand that the world had not ended. Clover just stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. Your portfolio, he said, nodding toward where it lay abandoned on the floor. A guard scurried to retrieve it, presenting it to him with a deep bow. Stellan took it, his fingers brushing the worn leather. Her scent clung to it, and he had to fight the instinct to bring it to his nose and inhale deeply. He opened it, his eyes scanning the neat, precise handwriting, the meticulously detailed plans. Impressive, he murmured. Very methodical. Very orderly. He looked back at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. It seems your work and your personal conduct are quite at odds, librarian. She flushed a brilliant, beautiful shade of crimson. I try my best, Your Majesty. Oh, I have no doubt of that, he said softly, closing the portfolio. Lord Valerius, he called out, his voice regaining its customary authority. A stern, gray-haired wolf in the front row stepped forward, bowing. Your Majesty. Librarian Ainsworth's duties are to be rearranged, Stellan announced. A murmur of surprise went through the crowd. She will still oversee the library project, but her primary station will be here, in the throne room. I require a personal archivist to document the daily proceedings of the court. Valerius's eyebrows shot up. Here, Your Majesty? But her work is in the archives 2 floors below. Her work is now wherever I say it is, Stellan said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Find her a desk, a table, something. Put it right there. He pointed to a spot near the dais, a place of honor usually reserved for his most trusted beta, a place where he would be able to see her. Always. He looked back at Clover, who seemed to have stopped breathing altogether. Welcome to court, Librarian Ainsworth, he said, his voice a low rumble. I have a feeling things are about to become much more interesting. Clover felt as though she were living in a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. Her life had been upended by a single catastrophic trip. She was no longer just Clover Ainsworth, the quiet Omega from the Western Branch Library. She was now the Throne Room Archivist, a title that was as absurd as it was terrifying. Her desk was an ornate antique writing table that had been hastily moved to the side of the dais. It placed her in the direct line of sight of not only the king, but the entire snickering, whispering court. She felt like an exhibit in a zoo. The clumsy Omega, observe its natural tendency for self-destruction. She spent her days pretending to take notes on the crushingly dull proceedings, her hand trembling so badly her script was barely legible. Every cough, every rustle of fabric from the assembled nobles felt like a judgment. She was acutely aware of the king's eyes on her. He didn't stare, not overtly, but she could feel the weight of his periodic glances. They were like a physical touch, a spark of heat on her skin that made her flush and drop her quill, spattering ink across her parchment. This, of course, only provided more fodder for the court's amusement. Her existence was a performance, and the king had a front-row seat. He had preserved the scene of her crime. The singed and blackened tapestry still hung on the wall, a permanent monument to her humiliation. The dented suit of armor had been reassembled, but it now leaned at a comical, drunken angle. The king would sometimes gaze at them, and a faint smile would touch his lips. The smile made her stomach twist into knots. He was laughing at her. The entire kingdom was laughing at her. Her primary tormentor was Lady Seraphina, a tall, elegant she-wolf with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as cold as a winter sky. She was an alpha female from a powerful bloodline, and it was widely whispered that she had long considered herself the future queen. Seraphina missed no opportunity to remind Clover of her inadequacy. "Do be careful with that inkpot, librarian," she would murmur as she passed Clover's desk, her voice dripping with false concern. "We wouldn't want you to redecorate the marble, would we? The king seems so fond of your current masterpiece." Her sycophantic followers would titter, their eyes glinting with malice. Clover would just dip her head, the heat of shame crawling up her neck, and pray for the floor to swallow her whole. She tried to make herself invisible, to move through the castle like a ghost. This was a spectacular failure. Her inherent clumsiness seemed to be amplified by the high-stakes environment. A week after her introduction, while tasked with returning a set of historical maps to the king's private study, she managed to knock over a gilded cage containing 2 of the royal falcons. The birds, startled and furious, burst out and began wreaking havoc in the great hall, swooping at nobles, stealing pastries from the breakfast buffet, and ultimately coming to roost on the head of a visiting duke, who fainted from fright. Stellan, who had been in a tense negotiation with his council, had simply stopped mid-sentence, watched a falcon snatch a piece of bacon from Lord Valerius's plate, and let out another one of his startling, rumbling laughs. He dismissed his stunned council and spent the next hour coaxing the birds down with a delighted grin on his face. He'd sent for her later, not to scold her, but to ask for a detailed, written account of the incident for his archives. She didn't understand him. His amusement felt like a crueler punishment than any anger. He was treating her like a court jester, a pet disaster he kept around for his own entertainment. The more she tried to be careful, the worse things became. She mistook the visiting Southern Alpha's ridiculously ostentatious toupee for a sleeping ferret and tried to shoo it off his head with a rolled-up scroll during a formal dinner. The resulting diplomatic incident was only smoothed over when King Stellan gifted the apoplectic Alpha a prize stallion from his personal stables, all while hiding a smirk behind his wine goblet. He started calling her his Chaos Queen, not to her face, but she heard the guards whispering it, heard the betas repeating it, with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The name echoed in the halls, a brand she couldn't escape. It was meant to be a term of affection from him, she dimly realized, but to her, it was just another word for failure. Her wolf, the timid creature she rarely felt, was in a constant state of agitated confusion. The king's scent, a powerful blend of pine, winter air, and something uniquely alpha that spoke of dominance and safety, was everywhere. It clung to the throne, filled the air around her desk, and seemed to follow her down the corridors. It should have been terrifying for an Omega. Instead, her dormant wolf would stir, a strange longing fluttering in her chest, a bizarre impulse to get closer to the source of that overwhelming scent, to feel the safety it promised. She squashed the feeling ruthlessly. It was a lie. There was no safety for her here. There was only ridicule and the constant, looming threat of the next inevitable disaster. She had to get away, before she broke something, or someone, that couldn't be fixed with a laugh. Stellan was alive again. It was as simple and as profound as that. The world, which had been a bleak, colorless landscape for 12 years, was now saturated with vibrant hues, all of them emanating from the small, perpetually flustered librarian he had installed by his side. He had forgotten what it was like to anticipate the day. Now he woke with a sense of eager curiosity, wondering what delightful form of chaos Clover would unleash upon his perfectly ordered world. His council was verging on open rebellion. Lord Valerius, his jaw perpetually tight with disapproval, presented him with a daily list of her transgressions. "Your Majesty, yesterday she managed to dye the royal fountain bright purple while attempting to clean her quill. It took 6 servants half the day to drain and scrub it. The carp are traumatized." Stellan had had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. "Are the carp essential to state security, Valerius?" No, Your Majesty, but the dignity of the crown is, Valerius had sputtered. She is making a mockery of this court. On the contrary, Stellan had replied, his voice cool. I find the court has been entirely too dignified for far too long. A little purple is good for the soul. Valerius had retreated, his scent thick with frustrated rage. Stellan didn't care. Let them disapprove. They saw a clumsy Omega who was a liability. He saw the woman whose accidental chaos had done what no healer, no counselor, no amount of time could do. She had made him feel. His wolf was a constant, rumbling presence in his chest now. A happy beast, basking in the proximity of its mate. It watched her every move with possessive delight. It adored the way her brow furrowed in concentration just before she knocked something over. The way her eyes widened in panic. The flush that crept up her lovely neck. Our mate is brilliant, it would purr in his mind. Look how she keeps them all on their toes. No one is bored when she is near. He knew he was frightening her. He could smell her fear, a constant sharp note under her soft, earthy scent. It was a thorn in his side. He saw the way she flinched when he laughed, the way she avoided his gaze. She thought he was mocking her. The idea sent a pang of actual pain through him, a sympathetic echo of the rejection his wolf felt. He had to show her. He had to find a way to bridge the chasm of status and fear that separated them. His chance came on a warm afternoon. Court was in recess, and the throne room was quiet for once. He was reviewing trade pacts, the words blurring into meaningless symbols on the page. He was too aware of her, sitting at her desk, carefully trying to repair the spine of an old book. She was so focused, her tongue peeking out from between her lips, that she didn't notice the precarious stack of scrolls she'd placed on the corner of her table. He watched, fascinated, as her elbow nudged the stack. It wobbled. She shifted, and it wobbled more. Then, with the slow, inevitable grace of a felled tree, the entire stack tipped over, right into the large basin of water she was using to moisten the bookbinding glue. A cloud of ink instantly billowed out, turning the clear water into a black, murky mess. Clover let out a small, defeated sigh, her shoulders slumping. She stared into the inky water as if it were a portal to all her life's failures. She didn't even seem surprised, just deeply, profoundly weary. This was not one of her grand public spectacles. This was a quiet moment of frustration, and it broke his heart. Before he could think, he was on his feet and crossing the space between them. She looked up as his shadow fell over her, her eyes wide with alarm, scrambling to stand and bow. Your Majesty, I'm so sorry. I'll clean it up right away. Clover, he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. It was the first time he had used her given name. She froze, her lips parted in surprise. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently took the ink-stained rag from her unresisting fingers. It's just water, he said quietly, dropping the rag onto the table. His gaze fell to her hands. They were covered in ink stains, the nails neatly trimmed, but the skin smudged with black and blue. They were the hands of someone who worked, who created, who tried. They were beautiful. Without thinking, he captured one of her hands in his. Her skin was soft, and a jolt, hot and electric, shot up his arm. He heard her sharp intake of breath. He slowly, deliberately, used his thumb to rub at a smudge of ink on her wrist. The gesture felt impossibly intimate in the vast, empty throne room. He took his time with it, gentle and unhurried, watching as the ink began to fade under his touch. He could feel her trembling slightly, could hear her breathing quicken. When he finally looked up, their eyes met, and he saw the moment awareness dawned in her gaze. Awareness of him, of the closeness between them, of something shifting irrevocably between their souls. You look tired, he murmured, his eyes lifting to meet hers. She was staring at their joined hands, her expression one of utter bewilderment. It has been a busy few weeks, Your Majesty, she stammered, refusing to meet his gaze. My wolf wants to soothe you, he found himself saying, the words slipping out, raw and honest, from the deepest part of him. Her head snapped up at that, her hazel eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrifying understanding. He was not talking about fountains or falcons. This was something else entirely. The fear in her scent spiked, sharp and painful. She snatched her hand back as if burned. "Your Majesty, I think I hear the head archivist calling for me," she lied, her voice thin and reedy. "I must go." Before he could say another word, she gathered her skirts and practically fled the throne room, leaving him standing alone in the sudden silence, the ghost of her touch tingling on his skin, and the bitter scent of her fear filling his lungs. The king's touch had branded her. Clover could still feel the phantom pressure of his thumb on her wrist, the shocking warmth of his hand enveloping hers. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it had terrified her more than any display of anger could have. "My wolf wants to soothe you." The words echoed in her mind, a dangerous, seductive melody. No one had ever wanted to soothe her. They wanted to fix her, contain her, or laugh at her. The idea that the Stone King, the most powerful alpha in the kingdom, harbored any sort of gentle feeling for her was so preposterous, so far outside the realm of possibility, that her mind refused to accept it. It had to be a trick, another part of his strange, cruel amusement. Or worse, it was pity. He felt sorry for the pathetic Omega who couldn't even get through a day without causing a scene. The thought was mortifying. She began to actively avoid him. She would arrive at her throne room desk before he entered and leave the moment the court was dismissed. She kept her head buried in her work, refusing to look up, refusing to give him an opening to speak to her again. This, of course, led to its own brand of disaster. Lost in her transcription of a lengthy border dispute document, she failed to notice a servant placing a tray with a pitcher of juice on the edge of her table. When she finally stood up, stiff and sore, she caught the leg of the table with her ankle, sending the entire tray flying. It didn't hit the floor. It flew in a perfect arc and landed directly in the lap of Lady Seraphina, who had been holding court with her circle of followers nearby. The shriek of outrage was operatic. The dark berry juice soaked Seraphina's pristine ice-blue gown, staining it a vulgar shade of purple. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. And then Seraphina rose to her feet, her beautiful face contorted with fury. Her alpha scent, usually a controlled perfume of frost and winter roses, flared into a hot, aggressive wave of rage. "You clumsy, worthless little rat," she snarled, her voice low and venomous. The courtly mask was gone, replaced by pure, predatory malice. "Look what you've done. This gown was a gift from the Alpha of the Silver Moon Pack." Clover stood frozen, her heart pounding with dread. I'm so sorry, Lady Seraphina. I didn't see." "You never see." Seraphina took a menacing step forward, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "You are a menace, a blight on this court. You stumble through this castle, leaving a trail of filth and destruction, and the king laughs. You are nothing but an Omega, a mistake. You don't belong here." Each word was a physical blow. They were the same words Clover had been telling herself for years, but hearing them spoken with such hatred was devastating. The whispers and snickers of the court rose around her, a chorus of agreement. She saw nodding heads, smug smiles. They all agreed with Seraphina. She was a mistake. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot with shame and humiliation. She wanted to disappear. "I believe," a low, cold voice cut through the noise like a blade of ice, "that you are addressing a member of my personal staff, Lady Seraphina." King Stellan had entered the room. He stood at the main entrance, his face a mask of cold fury that made his Stone King moniker seem like an understatement. The air grew heavy, crackling with the sheer force of his alpha presence. Every wolf in the room, from the highest-ranking beta to the lowest servant, felt the primal urge to submit, to lower their heads and bare their throats. Seraphina visibly paled, her rage evaporating into fear. "Your Majesty," she stammered, sinking into a deep curtsy. "I was merely... This Omega, she ruined..." "She had an accident," Stellan said, his voice dangerously quiet as he walked slowly toward them. He did not look at Seraphina. His eyes were locked on Clover, and in their depths she saw not amusement, but but a terrifying, protective fire. My wolf will never let you go. The thought was not her own. It was a feeling, a certainty that seemed to emanate from him, wrapping around her. He stopped beside Clover, placing himself between her and Serafina. The sheer power rolling off him was a wall, a fortress. "Apologize to her," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Serafina's eyes widened in disbelief. "Your Majesty? Apologize to her?" Now. The word was not a request. It was an alpha command, laced with a power that vibrated in the very bones. Serafina flinched as if struck. The pressure was unbearable. With a look of pure loathing directed at Clover, she bowed her head. "My apologies, librarian," she forced out through clenched teeth. "See that it doesn't happen again, Lady Serafina," Stellan said, his tone dismissive. He then turned his full attention to Clover. He gently took her elbow, his touch firm and grounding. "Come," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "Let us leave this unpleasantness." He led her from the throne room, leaving behind a stunned, silent court and a humiliated Lady Serafina. He didn't let go of her arm until they were in the quiet solitude of his private study. He guided her to a plush chair by the fire, and only then released her. He stood before her, his expression a tumultuous storm of emotions she couldn't decipher. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice raw. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, silent tracks of misery down her cheeks. He let out a harsh breath, the sound full of pain. He knelt before her, his knees hitting the thick rug, a king kneeling to an omega. The gesture was so shocking it made her gasp. "Clover," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she was afraid to name. "Don't cry. Please. I cannot bear it." He reached out, his hand hesitating before he gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The contact was electric. It was too much. The pity, the protection, the strange intensity in his eyes. It was a cage of a different kind, and she had to escape. "I need to leave," she whispered, finding her voice at last. "I can't stay here. I'll just cause more trouble. Please, Your Majesty, just let me go back to the branch library. I'll be quiet. No one will ever have to see me again." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, let me go." The transfer request lay on his desk like a death sentence. It was written in her neat, precise script, a formal petition to be reassigned to the most remote outpost in the kingdom, a library in a tiny village on the edge of the frozen north. The place was little more than a collection of huts. Sending her there would be tantamount to exile. Stellan stared at the parchment, and a cold, primal rage, deeper than any he had felt since the day of his parents' death, began to build within him. It was the rage of his wolf, the howl of a mate being abandoned. She is trying to leave us. The thought was a shard of ice in his heart. She wanted to run from him. After he had defended her, after he had shown her a piece of his soul, she wanted to flee to the furthest corner of the world, just to be away from him. The bond, fragile and new, throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. It was the echo of her fear and her determination to be gone. He had thought protecting her, showing his favor publicly, would reassure her. Instead, it had terrified her into flight. He had been a fool, brandishing his power like a club, when what she needed was quiet understanding. He crumpled the request in his fist, the parchment groaning in protest. He would not grant it. He would burn the entire kingdom down before he let her leave. He found her where he knew she would be, in the main library, seeking solace among the silent, steadfast shelves of books. She was trying to reshell the heavy tome on a high shelf, standing on a rickety wooden ladder. It was a disaster in the making. As he watched from the shadows of the doorway, she wobbled, the book slipped, and she let out a small cry as she lost her balance. He moved without thinking, crossing the vast room in 3 long strides, catching her just as she tumbled from the ladder. She landed against his chest with a soft oof. Her arms came up to brace against him, and for a heart-stopping moment, she was held fast in his embrace. She was so small, so light. Her scent, parchment and rain, and the unique, sweet fragrance that was just her, filled his senses, a calming balm to his raging wolf. Her heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched his own. He could have stood there forever, holding her, feeling her breath gradually steady against his chest, her body slowly relaxing as the panic subsided. But then she realized who he was. She stiffened, pushing away from him with a panicked gasp. "Your Majesty!" She scrambled back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wide with alarm. "I'm sorry, I slipped." "I know," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He held up the crumpled transfer request. "Is this what you want, Clover? To be sent to a frozen wasteland because you are afraid of me?" Her gaze dropped to the crumpled paper in his hand, and a shuttered, resigned expression came over her face. "It's for the best," she whispered, not looking at him. "I'm a disruption. Lady Seraphina was right. I don't belong here. I'm an Omega. You are the king. This, whatever this is, it's a mistake." "A mistake?" The word was a low growl. He stepped closer, crowding her against the bookshelf, trapping her not with force but with his sheer presence. He needed her to see. He needed her to understand. "You think the last 12 years of my life were not a mistake? I was a ghost, Clover. A king of stone and dust, ruling a silent, gray kingdom. I felt nothing. I was nothing. And then you fell into my life." He gestured wildly, his voice rising with a passion that stunned them both. "You crashed, you burned, you filled my perfectly ordered world with glorious, beautiful chaos. You think I am amused? I am not amused. I am awake. For the first time in 12 years, I am breathing again, and it is because of you." He paused, his breathing ragged, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. "Every single moment with you is a gift, Clover. Every disaster, every misstep, every beautiful catastrophe. You are not a mistake. You are the reason I remember how to live." She stared at him, her lips parted, her eyes filled with a dawning, terrified disbelief. The air between them was thick, humming with the force of his confession. You want me?" she whispered, the question so faint it was barely audible. "The woman who can't walk across a room without causing a catastrophe? The woman who destroyed your priceless tapestry?" The raw vulnerability in her question broke through the last of his control. He reached out, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her soft cheeks. His touch was reverent. "Clover," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, desperate whisper. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "You didn't destroy a tapestry. You destroyed 12 years of nothing. You destroyed the silence. You destroyed the stone." He felt a tremor run through her. He could feel her confusion, her doubt, warring with the undeniable truth of the bond that pulsed between them. "The bond between us cannot be denied." "You are my mate," he breathed, the words a sacred vow in the quiet of the library. "My other half. My wolf knew it from the first moment, and my soul knows it now. I don't want the perfect, graceful Luna the court expects. I want you. I want my Chaos Queen." She made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat, and a single tear escaped her eye, tracing a path his thumb followed. "I don't know how," she whispered. "I don't know how to be what you need." "You don't have to be anything," he murmured, his own eyes burning. "Just be you. Just stay." He felt the subtle shift in her, the slight easing of the terror that had held her so rigid. It was not acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness of her fear. And for him, it was everything. He would fight the entire world for that flicker of hope. He would prove to her, and to everyone, that she was not a mistake. She was his destiny. The annual Grand Concord, a summit where the leaders of all allied pacts gathered to renew treaties, was the pinnacle of the court's social and political calendar. It was an event planned with military precision, every detail scrutinized to ensure a flawless display of the Graves Pack's power and dignity. It was, Stellan knew, the perfect stage for his enemies to make their move. Lord Valerius and Lady Seraphina had been quiet since the public humiliation in the throne room, but it was the quiet of a predator stalking its prey. Stellan could scent their resentment and ambition every time they were in the same room. They would not let the matter of a clumsy Omega capturing their king's heart rest. He had tried to persuade Clover to remain in the library during the Concord, to stay where she was safe, but she had refused. A new, fragile spine of determination was beginning to form within her. "If I am to stay," she had told him, her voice trembling but firm, "I cannot hide. I have to learn to walk through this world without bringing it all down." He had admired her courage so much it ached. He'd agreed, but assigned 2 of his most loyal guards to watch over her from a distance. The main event was a formal dinner in the Great Hall. The long tables gleamed with silver and crystal. Leaders from a dozen packs, massive alphas with their betas and elegantly dressed lunas, filled the room with a low hum of conversation and a complex mingling of pack scents. Clover was tasked with a simple, seemingly foolproof duty: ensuring the ceremonial Concord quill and the ancient treaty document were in place on a small pedestal near the head table before the signing ceremony began. She performed the task flawlessly, her movements careful and deliberate. A wave of pride washed through Stellan as he watched her. She placed the quill, a magnificent plume from a golden eagle, in its stand and turned to walk away. And then the trap was sprung. As Clover passed a table of delegates from the Sunstone Pack, a young beta suddenly lurched to his feet, crying out and clutching his throat. He gasped for air, his face turning a frightening shade of red, before collapsing to the floor. Pandemonium erupted. The boy's alpha, a formidable wolf named Lord KL, roared in fury and rushed to his son's side. "He's been poisoned!" a voice cried out, Lady Seraphina's. Her eyes, wide with feigned horror, were fixed on Clover. "She was just there! I saw her brush past him!" All heads turned. Clover stood frozen in the middle of the floor, a deer in the headlights of 100 pairs of accusing eyes. Lord Valerius stepped forward, his face a mask of grave concern. "Your Majesty, this is a grave tragedy, an attack on an honored guest under your own roof. The boy was served from the same pitcher as everyone else. But the librarian, she passed so close. Perhaps she carried something on her person? A powder? A poison?" It was a masterful setup, plausible, insidious, and utterly damning. Lord Kale, his eyes wild with grief and rage, turned his glare on Stellan. "Graves, what is the meaning of this? Is this how you honor an alliance? My son lies dying, and your pet Omega is the cause." "She is not my pet." Stellan's voice was dangerously low as he rose to his feet. "And she is not a poisoner." But the seed was planted. The hall was in an uproar. Accusations flew. The Concord was on the verge of collapsing into open hostility. "Seize her!" Kale bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Clover. "She must be tried. If you will not give us justice, Stellan, we will take it." Clover shrank back, her face as white as parchment. The terror rolling off her was a physical agony to Stellan, a knife twisting in the mate bond. He saw her future in that moment, torn apart by a vengeful pack, his kingdom shattered by a broken alliance, all because his enemies had used her as a weapon. This was their endgame, to force him to choose, sacrifice the Omega or sacrifice his kingdom. He looked at Clover, alone and terrified in a sea of snarling wolves. He saw the girl who had tripped over a dress, the woman who had dyed a fountain purple, the mate whose chaotic spirit had brought him back from the dead. The choice was not a choice at all. There was no kingdom without her. With a deep breath, Stellan drew on the full, terrifying power of his bloodline. "Silence!" The Alpha command was not a word, but a shockwave. It slammed into every person in the hall, forcing them to their knees. Sound ceased. Movement ceased. Even Lord Kale, in the throes of his rage, was forced into submission. his head bowed. The only person left standing besides Stellan was Clover, who was somehow shielded from the full force of his power by the bond between them. She stared at him, her eyes wide. In the ringing silence, Stellan walked down from the dais and stood before her. He turned to face the cowed assembly. "You want to know who she is?" he asked, his voice resonating with absolute power. "You see an Omega, a clumsy librarian, a disruption." He reached out and took Clover's hand, lacing his fingers with hers, a silent declaration to the world. Her hand was trembling, but she did not pull away. "I see my salvation," he declared, his voice ringing with unshakable conviction. "This is Clover Ainsworth, my fated mate, your future queen." A collective gasp went through the hall, even in their forced submission. He turned his burning gaze on Valerius and Seraphina, who were trembling on the floor. "You thought to use her to destroy me. You thought I would cast her aside to preserve order. You know nothing of loyalty. You know nothing of the bond." He looked back at the crowd. "For 12 years, this kingdom has had a king of stone. I was empty, and she, with her chaos and her light, filled that emptiness. This attack was not her doing. It was a cowardly plot by those who fear change, who fear a queen whose worth is not in her bloodline or her grace, but in her heart." He squeezed her hand gently, anchoring her, steadying her. "She is my Luna," he said, his voice soft but heard by all. "Chosen by me. Anyone who dares to harm her will answer to me, and to my entire pack. Let that be my justice." He squeezed her hand, and in that moment, as she looked at him, the fear in her eyes was finally, blessedly, replaced by a dawning, radiant hope. The stone had cracked. The chaos had won. The aftermath of Stellan's declaration was swift and absolute. Under the pressure of his alpha's unwavering certainty and the undeniable strength of his conviction, the young beta's poisoning was revealed for the sham it was. A vial of a fast-acting but harmless paralytic agent designed to mimic the signs of poisoning was found in Lord Valerius's chambers. He and Lady Seraphina, their plot exposed and their ambition laid bare, were stripped of their titles and lands, sentenced to a life of exile in the very same desolate northern outpost Valerius had once tried to send Clover to. The irony was not lost on anyone. Lord Kael, deeply shamed, offered a profound apology, his respect for Stellan's devotion to his mate overriding his initial anger. The Concord was saved, the treaties renewed with a new sense of loyalty forged in the fire of Stellan's stand. But for Clover, the true aftermath was the quiet that followed. Stellan led her away from the murmuring hall, back to the peace of the royal library. The moonlight streamed through the tall arched windows, painting the rows of books in silver. He led her to the center of the room and finally turned to face her, his expression tender and uncertain for the first time. "Clover," he began, his voice losing its kingly authority, becoming just the voice of a man afraid of hearing her answer. "I know that was a lot. I did not mean to force you, to claim you so publicly without—" She stopped him by placing a hand on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. "You didn't force me," she said, her own voice clearer and stronger than she had ever heard it. "You saved me. You chose me." "I choose you too," she whispered, looking up into his intense gray eyes. "Alpha King Stellan Graves. I choose you before all witnesses, seen and unseen." Stellan's breath hitched. The raw relief and joy that washed over his face was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He brought his other hand up to cover hers, pressing it more firmly against his heart. "My Chaos Queen," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "My Luna, my everything." He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss. It was not a kiss of demand or passion, but of reverence and homecoming. It was soft and searching, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of pine and winter air, of safety and forever. It was the sealing of a bond, a promise made not with words, but with the silent language of two souls finally finding their other half. In the weeks that followed, the court transformed. The stiff formality gave way to a cautious warmth. The sight of their once stone king now smiling openly, his eyes constantly seeking out his clumsy, beloved Luna, was a tonic for the entire kingdom. Clover was still Clover. She still occasionally tripped on rugs and spilled ink, but now, instead of snickers, she was met with fond, indulgent smiles. Her chaos was no longer a mark of shame. It was a celebrated part of the queen, who had brought joy back to their world. Life as Luna was a surprising fit. Clover found that her librarian's mind for organization was invaluable in managing the kingdom's social affairs, though her methods were often unorthodox. She reorganized the royal charity distribution using a system based on the migration patterns of squirrels, which somehow proved to be twice as efficient. She settled a territorial dispute between two grumpy old betas by challenging them to a jam-making contest. Her quiet resilience became a formidable strength, her empathy a bridge between the nobility and the common pack members. She was beloved. And she was still, gloriously, chaotic. One afternoon, Stellan walked into their private chambers to find her surrounded by a flock of baby lambs, all wearing tiny flower crowns. She'd been trying to help a shepherd whose ewe had triplets and somehow ended up adopting them. Stellan just shook his head, a wide, easy smile on his face, and knelt beside her to help bottle feed the smallest one. "My chaos queen," he murmured, nuzzling into her neck to inhale her scent. He felt the low, rumbling purr of contentment in her chest, a sound that was now his favorite in all the world. "You know," she said, a mischievous glint in her hazel eyes, "I was thinking the throne room could use more color. Perhaps a new tapestry? Something with more purple." Stellan threw his head back and laughed, the sound rich and free, echoing through the halls. Months had passed since the Grand Concord. Clover was Luna now, fully and completely, a role she had grown into with surprising grace. The court had warmed to her. The burned tapestry still hung on the wall. Stellan still refused to let anyone repair it. The dented armor still leaned at its comical angle in the corner. They were monuments to the day chaos changed everything. It was a normal afternoon in the throne room. Court was in session, the various lords and ladies conducting their business with practiced efficiency. Clover sat at her old desk, the same ornate writing table that had been her throne room home since that first catastrophic day. Old habits died hard. She had her own quarters now, her own chambers as Luna, but she still preferred to work here, among the records and accounts, staying close to where the heartbeat of the kingdom pulsed. She was carrying something delicate today, a crystal inkwell that had been a gift from Lord Kale of the Sunstone Pack, a peace offering and a symbol of renewed alliance. It was exquisite, deep blue glass that caught the light like captured sapphires. She was walking toward her desk, carefully watching her feet, concentrating fiercely on not tripping. She made it 3/4 of the way there. Something caught her hem. It was always something. A rough board, a fraying edge, the simple bad luck that seemed to follow her like a shadow. She felt the telltale snag and knew, with the terrible prescience of long experience, what was about to happen. She stumbled. Her hand jerked. The crystal inkwell flew from her grip and arced through the air in a beautiful, terrible trajectory. It landed on the marble floor with a tremendous crash, shattering spectacularly. The blue ink that it contained exploded outward in a glorious starburst, spreading across the pristine white marble in a tide of deep azure color. The court gasped. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the sound of destruction. Everyone looked at the queen, standing in the middle of her latest disaster, her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide with that familiar, horrified expression. Then everyone looked at the king. Stellan sat upon his throne, his gray eyes taking in the scene, the blue ink spreading across the floor like a tide, the glittering shards of crystal, his Luna standing in the center of it all, waiting for judgment. The entire court held its breath. A king could laugh at a tapestry once, but twice? In the exact same way? It seemed like tempting fate. Then, slowly, a smile spread across Stellan's face. It started small, a quirk of his lips, and grew wider. His shoulders began to shake, and then he laughed. It was the same sound that had first broken the silence of his heart, the same full-bodied, joyous laugh that had echoed through the throne room on that first catastrophic day. But this time, something was different. Clover laughed too. She stood in the middle of her latest disaster, surrounded by the wreckage of good intentions, and she laughed. Not with shame, not with fear, but with genuine, unrestrained joy. Because she finally understood. The chaos wasn't a flaw, it wasn't a curse. It was music. It was the song that had brought a stone kingdom back to life. It was proof that she was exactly where she was meant to be, with the man who loved her not in spite of her beautiful disasters, but because of them. The court, watching their king and queen laugh together in the wreckage, watching them find joy in the very thing that should have been a tragedy, began to laugh too. First a few tentative chuckles, then a swelling tide of genuine warmth and amusement. The throne room, which had been so cold and silent for so long, filled with sound. It filled with warmth. It filled with life. In the castle of the Stone King, there hung a tapestry that no one was allowed to repair. A suit of armor that leaned at a permanent angle, and now a deep blue stain on the marble floor that would remain for 100 years. The court historian would note, in her neat, precise handwriting, that these were not blemishes on the kingdom. They were its heartbeat. They were proof that a king who had once known nothing but stone had learned to love chaos, had learned to laugh again, had learned that sometimes a little beautiful disaster was exactly what a perfectly ordered world needed to remember how to live. And on the throne sat a man who laughed every day, because his chaos queen never ran out of ways to remind him that their life together was not a mistake. It was a miracle. It was everything.